I've always been the kind of person who makes sure everyone else is okay before I think about myself. That's just who I am. I grew up watching my mother hold the whole house together with both hands and a smile she saved for company, so I learned early that being dependable meant being invisible in the best possible way. People could count on you without having to think too hard about you. I thought that was love. For a long time I really did. I was 31 when my doctor told me I needed surgery. Not a dramatic clear your schedule emergency, but not optional either. I'd been managing a uterine fibroid for almost 2 years by that point, trying everything my GP suggested first, and by January it had gotten to the point where my quality of life was genuinely suffering. My gynecologist referred me to a specialist at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, and after an ultrasound and a consult, we scheduled a laparoscopic myomectomy for the second week of March. The surgeon had one opening that worked with my OHIP coverage and her surgical calendar. That was the date. I didn't pick it to be difficult. I didn't pick it to test anyone. That was simply the date. The problem was that my brother and his wife had already booked a 10-day trip to Costa Rica for that same window. They'd announced it at my parents' house the previous October, over dinner, with a printout of their resort itinerary and everything. My parents had been so excited for them. My sister-in-law was turning 40. My brother, who is 4 years older than me and has always been the golden child, the one who calls every Sunday, the one who shows up with wine and a story, wanted to make it special for her. I understood that. I genuinely did. When I told my family about the surgery date in late January, there was a pause on the phone that I still long pause, maybe 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, I heard everything. My mother said, "Oh, sweetheart, that's the same week as Costa Rica." I said I knew. She said, "Well, you'll be fine. You're always so strong." I told her I was nervous. I told her it was the first surgery I'd ever had, and that I was nervous about the anesthetic, and that I really wanted someone with me when I woke up. I said it plainly. I was 31 years old, and I asked my mother to be there when I woke up from surgery. She said she'd see what she could do. My father didn't say much. He rarely does when my brother is involved. My brother is the one who moved back to Mississauga after university, who bought a house 3 streets over from my parents, who coaches my nephew's hockey team, and shows up for every birthday barbecue. I moved to Toronto proper for work, which in my family somehow translated into a kind of vague disloyalty. Not anything anyone would say out loud. Just something that hung in the air at Christmas. In the end, no one changed their plans. I heard about the final decision secondhand through a text from my mother 2 weeks before the surgery. "We're going to trust that you're in good hands at the hospital. Call us when you're out. Love you." That was it. 12 words and a sign-off. The only person who called me after that was my father's older sister, my aunt, who we all call Auntie Bet. She's 73, drives a 2018 Corolla, and has lived in the same house in Scarborough since 1989. She called me on a Thursday evening while I was making dinner, and she said, "I heard about your operation. What time do I need to be there?" I told her she didn't have to. She said, "I didn't ask if I had to. I asked what time." I cried in my kitchen with the stove still on. I'm not embarrassed about that anymore. The surgery was on a Tuesday. Auntie Bet picked me up at 6 in the morning. She'd brought a thermos of tea for herself, and a small bag of ginger candies for me, because she'd read somewhere that ginger helps with post-anesthesia nausea. She sat in the waiting room for 4 hours while I was in surgery, reading a paperback she'd brought from home. And when I opened my eyes in the recovery room and the nurse told me my aunt was waiting, I felt something loosen in my chest that I didn't even realize had been tight. She drove me home. She made sure I was settled on the couch with my medications organized on the coffee table. She had already been to my apartment the day before. I'd given her a key, and stocked my fridge with things I could eat easily. Yogurt, soft bread, a container of the chicken soup she makes that I've loved since I was a child. She left a handwritten list on the kitchen counter. Which pill at what time, when to call the doctor, what symptoms to watch for. Then she sat with me for 3 hours while I dozed in and out of the anesthetic fog. And when she finally left that evening she said, "I'll be back Thursday." She was back Thursday. My parents landed in Costa Rica that Tuesday evening. My mother sent a voice note saying the resort was beautiful, and that she hoped everything had gone smoothly, and that she'd check in soon. My brother texted a thumbs up and a red heart. I didn't respond right away. Not because I was being cold. I was just tired and in pain and honestly a little stunned. I kept looking at those messages like they were in a language I used to know but had somehow forgotten. The days after surgery were harder than I expected. I knew recovery would take time, but I hadn't fully understood what that would feel like on my own. Auntie Bet came by every 2 or 3 days. She'd check on my incision sites, make sure I was eating, sit with me and watch something on TV when I couldn't sleep. She drove me to my first post-operative appointment. She sat in the room with me and asked the surgeon questions I hadn't thought to ask. She took notes in a small notebook she kept in her purse. Meanwhile, the Costa Rica trip was going wonderfully, by all accounts. My mother's Instagram had pictures of sunsets and cocktails and my sister-in-law in a white sundress on the beach. My nephew was at my parents' neighbor's house, being watched by their teenage daughter. Everything had been arranged. Everything was working out perfectly. What I want to be careful about saying is that I expected my family to ruin their trip. I didn't. Once the date was set and they'd made their decision, I never asked them to change it. What I had expected, what I think any person would reasonably expect, was that when they came home, things would shift. That someone would call and ask how the recovery was going. That my mother would come by the apartment. That my brother would at least take me out for coffee and say, "Hey, that must have been scary. How are you actually doing?" They came home on a Saturday. I know because my mother posted a photo at Pearson Arrivals. My sister-in-law was holding a little sombrero she'd bought for my nephew. My mother called me that Sunday. She talked for 25 minutes about the resort. The excursion they'd done to a waterfall, the food, the other couple they'd befriended at the pool bar. At the end of the call, right before she said goodbye, she asked, "And you're feeling better?" I said yes. She said, "Good, you're so resilient." I didn't say anything after that. I just said goodbye and put the phone down. My brother never came by. He texted once to ask if I needed anything, and when I said a ride to my second follow-up appointment would be helpful. He said he had something with the hockey team that weekend, but that his wife could probably drop me off. Not pick me up, just drop me off. Because she had plans after. I said not to worry about it. Auntie Bet took me to every single follow-up appointment. All 4 of them. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that she was keeping track. Not in a deliberate, calculated way. More like the way people who have lived long enough start to notice patterns, and once they notice them, they can't unknow them. She kept that small notebook. She wrote down dates. She wrote down what was said and what wasn't said. She took screenshots of things I'd shared with her, the voice notes, the thumbs-up text, the Instagram posts with their timestamps. She didn't tell me she was doing this. She just did it quietly, the way she does everything. My family's 25th anniversary party was in June. My parents had been planning it for months. A dinner at a banquet hall in Mississauga, about 60 people, catered, the whole thing. My brother had coordinated most of it. My sister-in-law had done the flowers. I'd been asked to write a toast, which I did. I wrote something genuine about my parents' marriage, about what I'd learned from watching them over the years. I practiced it in my apartment, and I drove out to Mississauga in a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. I want to be honest. I had complicated feelings going into that evening. By June I was fully recovered physically, but I was still carrying something I didn't quite have words for yet. A kind of recalibration. I'd spent 3 months quietly revising my understanding of who was in my corner, and the math wasn't adding up the way I'd always assumed it would. But I put on my dress and I drove to Mississauga, and I was prepared to give my toast and smile in the photos and let it be a good night. Auntie Bet was already there when I arrived. She was wearing the navy blazer she wears to every family event, and her hair was done the way she does it for special occasions, and she hugged me at the door and said I looked beautiful. Dinner was lovely. The food was good, a chicken option and a vegetarian pasta, salad, bread, wine. People gave speeches. My brother gave a funny one about my parents arguing over the thermostat for 25 years. My sister-in-law cried nicely. My mother held my father's hand across the table and looked genuinely happy. I gave my toast. People clapped. My mother mouthed thank you at me from across the room. And then Auntie Bet asked for the microphone. Now, I should say, Auntie Bet is not a loud person. She doesn't seek attention. She has opinions, strong ones, but she tends to share them privately, with people she trusts, in a measured tone that makes you feel like you're being told the truth rather than being lectured. So when she stood up and asked for the microphone, I noticed a few people exchange glances. My mother looked pleasantly surprised, like she was expecting a toast about the early years, stories from before I was born. Auntie Bet thanked everyone for being there. She said my parents' 25 years were worth celebrating. She said she meant that genuinely. Then she paused. She said she wanted to talk about something else too. Something that had been sitting with her, and that she believed needed to be said in a room full of people who called themselves family. The air in that room changed. I can't describe it any other way. It just shifted, the way air does before a storm. She said she wanted to start on March 11th. She took out the small notebook from her blazer pocket. She said, "On March 11th, I underwent a scheduled laparoscopic surgery at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto." She named the surgery. She said I had been nervous and that I had asked my parents to be there, and that they had been on a planned vacation and were unable to attend. She was careful with her language. She didn't say they had chosen wrong. She just stated what had happened and when. Then she read from her notes. She read the dates of every follow-up appointment I'd had, and who had taken me to each one. She read the date my mother had called, and the duration of the call and the subject of the conversation. She read my brother's text, not the words, exactly, but the gist of it, accurately. She talked about the Instagram posts, the timestamps. She said that in the 72 hours after I came out of surgery, the only communication I had received from my immediate family was a voice note about a resort and a text message containing a thumbs-up emoji. She read that back twice. She said she wanted to make sure everyone heard it clearly. My father's face had gone very still. My brother had put down his wine glass. My sister-in-law was looking at the table. My mother's expression had moved through surprise and into something harder and more defensive, and I recognized that expression because I had seen it my whole life. The one that means she knows she's been caught, but isn't ready to admit it yet. People in the room were shifting in their seats. I heard one of my mother's friends from church say something quietly to her husband. My cousin who lives in Hamilton was looking at me from across the room, and the look on her face was not pity. It was recognition, and that was somehow both harder and easier to see than pity would have been. My brother said, "This is not the right place for this." Auntie Bet said, "I disagree. I think a room full of the people who love this family is exactly the right place." He said she was overreacting. He said it was a planned trip. They'd had no choice. I had been fine. She said she knew it was planned. She said that wasn't the point. He said, "Then what's the point?" She said the point was that when your sister calls you from a hospital and says she's scared, you find a way to matter. She said the point was the 72 hours after, and the phone calls that never came, and the follow-up appointments, and the 4 months of recovery during which I had never once been a subject of conversation at Sunday dinner. She knew this because she had asked. She had been at Sunday dinner herself, twice during that period, and she had watched my name go unmentioned while people talked about hockey schedules and a kitchen renovation my brother was planning. She closed the notebook. She said, "I'm not asking anyone in this room to feel ashamed. I'm asking them to see what I've seen. Because the child you raised is sitting in this room right now in a beautiful dress she bought for your party, and she drove out here from Toronto, and she wrote you a toast. And I want you to really look at her and understand what that took." Nobody said anything. My mother started crying, not the composed, photogenic crying from the earlier speeches, real crying, the kind that doesn't photograph well. She put her face in her hands. My father looked at me for a long moment. He's not an expressive man. He's never been one for declarations. But he stood up from his seat, slowly, the way he does since his knees started giving him trouble. And he walked around the table and he put his hand on my shoulder and he stood there. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. And I don't know exactly why, but that undid me more than anything else. I didn't make a scene. I'm not telling you I kept it together perfectly, because I didn't. I cried. A few people around me reached over and touched my arm or squeezed my hand. My cousin from Hamilton crossed the room and sat down next to me and didn't say anything either, which was exactly right. My brother didn't come over that night. He and his wife left early. My sister-in-law had tears in her eyes when she picked up her coat, and I think they were genuine. But I also think she didn't know what to do with them. The weeks that followed were strange. My mother called me the next morning, early, before 8, which she never does. She didn't apologize immediately. My mother doesn't apologize immediately for anything. She talked around it for a while, saying things like, "I had no idea you were struggling that much, and why didn't you say something?" Which, to be honest, made me want to hang up the phone. I had said something. I had said it plainly on a January phone call, that I was nervous and I wanted someone there. But I didn't say that, I just listened. Eventually she said, "I'm sorry we weren't there." 6 words, but she said them and she meant them, and I heard both things. My brother took longer. It was almost August before he called me. A real call, not a text, and he asked if he could come over. He showed up at my apartment with a bag of groceries, because that's how he expresses things he can't say out loud. And he sat at my kitchen table, and he told me that hearing Auntie Bet say those things at the party was one of the worst moments of his life. He said not because it was embarrassing, though it was, but because he recognized in real time in front of 60 people that she was right. He said he'd spent the months between March and June telling himself that I was fine, because I never told him I wasn't. And then he heard Auntie Bet describe the specific shape of what had happened. And he realized he'd been confusing silence with okayness. And that he'd been doing that his whole life, not just with me. That was the most honest thing my brother had said to me in probably a decade. I didn't tell him it made everything okay, because it didn't, not completely, and he didn't ask me to. We sat at my kitchen table and we talked for almost 2 hours, which is more than we've ever talked in our adult lives, and somewhere in there we managed to start building something that I think might actually last. My relationship with my parents is different now. Not damaged, exactly. Different. My mother calls more often, and the calls are shorter, which means they're more real. My father started texting me, nothing long, just small things, an article he thought I'd like, a question about something I'd mentioned in passing. It's not a lot, but from him it's a shift, and I'm learning to receive it without measuring it against everything I wanted and didn't get. Auntie Bet and I have Sunday dinners now. Not every week. She plays bridge on alternating Sundays, and is not willing to give that up, which is a completely reasonable position and one I respect. But most Sundays I drive to Scarborough and she makes something, and we eat at her table in the kitchen, where she's had the same curtains since 1994, and we talk about everything. About our family and its history and the patterns she's watched repeat across generations. About my grandfather, who she says was both the best and most exasperating man she ever knew. About what she sees in me that I don't always see in myself. She told me once, over soup, that she hadn't planned to say anything at the party. She'd been going back and forth for weeks. She said she almost didn't, right up until my brother gave his speech about the thermostat and everyone laughed, and she looked across the room and saw my face as I laughed along with everyone else, and something in her just decided. I asked if she was worried about the fallout. She said, "I'm 73. I've been worried about the wrong things my whole life. I thought it was time to stop." I think about that a lot. There's something I've had to reckon with in the past year, something I wouldn't have understood before all of this. The people who show up for you are not always the people you expected. And expecting them doesn't make them show up. And releasing that expectation is not the same as giving up on them. It's closer to finally seeing clearly. And seeing clearly even when what you see is hard, is almost always better than the alternative. I'm not the same person I was before March. I don't think I'm worse for it. I think I've gotten quieter in some ways. More precise about where I put my energy. I still have the same family I've always had. The same complicated, imperfect, improving family. But I also have Auntie Bet. And her small notebook. And her Sunday dinners in Scarborough. She showed up when I was alone and frightened and told her not to bother. She took notes. She waited for the right moment. And then she stood up in a room full of people. And she said the thing that needed to be said. Clearly and without, because she believed I was worth saying it for. I think that's what love looks like when it's done properly. Not the grand declarations. Not the resort photos or the anniversary parties. Just the person who shows up at 6 in the morning with ginger candies and a thermos of tea, and who remembers everything, and who doesn't let you become invisible, not on her watch.